Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. This is lesson 21. Come follow me, Book of Mormon 21, Mosiah 29 through Alma 4. And I'm reading off my notes here. So for this lesson, Mosiah 29 is peeled off from the rest of the book of Mosiah and put in with Alma 1 through 4. The reason they did this is to contrast the ending of the kingdom and the transition to judges and this kind of religious democratization and political democratization against these two very negative examples of Nehor and Amasai. Um, so so the intent is to present this body of text and say, hey, look at these two very different groups of people. There's two very different outcomes, and look at the influence that very righteous individuals and very evil individuals can have on the population in general. Now, I personally would not slice off Mosiah 29 from the rest of the book of Mosiah. Okay, and this is based on my approach to the book of Mosiah. The way I see the book of Mosiah is it is Mormon's masterwork. The book of Mosiah is a very dense, tight, very well written set of text with clear theological intentions to it, and chapter 29 kind of ends that set of text by presenting a very clear message that is being built up through 24, 25, 26, and so on. So I feel like we really need to take the book of Mosiah in its entirety as a whole, because the way Mormon's writing it and the way he wants to deal with the people that he's presenting, chapter 29 ends on two righteous kings and a righteous religious leader, and that's very much Mormon's intent. So chapter 29 presents a reversal of the Old Testament pattern of rejecting judges in favor of kings, which we see from the book of Judges through Samuel and into the Old Testament book of Kings. The book of Judges shows how bad things got under Israel during the rule or the reigns of the judges, and the result was the Lord anointed a king under Samuel's hand instead, despite all of the problems kings present. The kings of Israel and Judah were not all that great, but they still weren't as bad as the judges. Like when you read the book of Judges, it's just a series of egregiously bad examples of how awful some of these people were. Like the better guys, like Gideon, were kind of like faithless and unbelieving, and would only do things if the Lord just really overproved himself. And then you had just horrible examples all through that text. And you have Samson. Yeah, sure, Samson killed a lot of bad guys, but he sure didn't do himself any favors, and he was clearly a man with deep flaws. And that's really the purpose of the book of Judges, is to show you how bad things were among Israel in general under this kind of loose, informal confederation where people just kind of did whatever they wanted. And that appears in the book of Judges repeatedly. You'll see like a story, and then it'll say in a verse, it'll say, and this is because there was no king in Israel. And then they'll tell another horrible story and say, well, this is because there was no king in Israel and everybody just did whatever they wanted. And then it would tell another horrible story and then say, this because there was no king in Israel. So the assumption is that Samuel is the one who edited or compiled the book of Judges as an explanation of why the Lord went ahead with kings. Because, kings really aren't all that great either, as we just read about in the book of Mosiah. I mean, we had some good kings like King Benjamin, and then we had a really awful king like Noah. And that's part of Mormon's intent, is to contrast these two different lines. You had Mosiah, then Benjamin, then Mosiah, and then you had Zenith and Noah, and then Limhi. In contrast, and then you had all of the theological stuff going on in there, where in this line the people do well because they accept messianism and they enjoy peace and prosperity by and large. And then you have this group that undergoes a lot of trials and a lot of problems because one very bad king, Noah, really blows it and drags the people down into sin, surrounds himself with awful priests, and just does a lot of awful things that results in invasion and all these terrible things happening. And that's Mormon's intent. Mormon's intent is to present these two bodies and as theological opposites, and they, to say, like, look, here are the choices. And then when it comes down to chapter 29, King Mosiah is faced with a situation where he knows what's happened with this other splinter group. Noah went horribly bad. There was all of this terrible stuff happening, and then they bring in these plates of Jared, the Jaredites, the plates of ether, and then they read them and they're like, whoa, that's a huge long history of lots of people suffering terribly as there are all of these wars over control of the monarchy. So there's that very, even though that happened thousands, years ago, and then they only have the leftover record, Mosiah just translated it. So this is something fresh in their mind. And you add that on to the situation with Noah, which just is fresh in mind because this group of people just came back in. And then Mosiah's sons go bad, and they're trying to subvert the church. They're persecuting the believers. So Mosiah is very much caught up in this, like, whoa, this is, messy, and what if my sons go bad again, and then there's all these horrible wars, you guys, the people. This is the appeal that Mosiah is having to the people, his own subjects. He's like, hey, look, if my son goes bad and you guys start fighting amongst each other, it's going to be terrible for you. You're all going to get killed. So let's go back to Judges. And then you'll have higher judges keep in check the lower ones, and then this will kind of normalize things, and hopefully the people will choose to do good things and be righteous. So it's sort of a democracy. Historians can argue about whether it's a democracy or not, but this is he's setting up Judges, which is the reverse of what's happening in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, judges are really horrid, so let's go to kings, and things won't be so bad under kings. And I mean, kings have their ups and downs among Israel and Judah, and I mean, there's some pretty egregious cases there. But by and large, for a relatively long period of time, Israel prospers under kings. The body in general, even though you have some particularly bad kings thrown in there. I mean, there's some very ugly things in their history as well, but nowhere near as bad as what happened under Judges. Okay, but Mosiah chooses to do the exact opposite. He switches it and takes it over and says, look, we need to go with judges instead of kings. So this is a reversal of what's happening in the Old Testament. And I think this is Mormon's intent, is to show the reasoning why Mosiah did this and why it was a good decision. And he ends that book that way to show you that Mosiah, Benjamin, and Mosiah were these three very good, very spiritual leaders who really were selfless, and they put the people first. They put their subjects first, and they really wanted what was best for them, and they wanted to do what would lead to the least amount of suffering and misery for their people. And the implication there is Mosiah, Benjamin, and Mosiah were righteous men who believed in the scriptures and they believed in messianism, and therefore they were doing the right thing, and they were inspired to do the right thing, and they had what was in their people's best interest in heart, and they were doing the right thing. And I think that's Mormon's intent, is to say, look, this is how things turn out when you have good people ruling and good people in positions of authority. So it ends on this, up note, this solid note with King Mosiah. So Mosiah decides the dangers presented by bad kings is entirely too great, so they need to switch to judges, and he puts in place a means to have the judges keep each other in check. The context is clearly that of the negative example of Noah, and the additional examples of Jaredites in chapter 28 wade into Mosiah's decision as well. And then the fear over his own sons from chapter 27 has to be weighing in on the decision as well. Um, uh, chapter 29 closes out the book of Mosiah by presenting the king, putting the people before himself and the monarchy, just as his father and grandfather had. And then we can also assume that Limhi felt the same way. Limhi kind of drops out of the picture after they read the record and read the Jaredite plates. We never hear about Limhi again. So clearly he had to be willing to let go of his control over those people, and like cede his authority or cede his responsibility over to King Mosiah. So he's a good guy too. He didn't try to maintain his population separate from the Nephites and the Mulekites, and then there's there's the Limhites too. I don't want to let go of my authority. I don't want to let go of rulership. He seems to be perfectly willing to let go. So that speaks well for him also, because you have two guys who are perfectly willing to let go of any personal selfish goals or selfish aspirations for the better of the people. So Mormon's editing hand closes out the book with the extraordinary examples of the final Nephite kings. So then we get into Alma 1, 2, and 3. These chapters present two sets of characters who are complete opposites, contrast them, and contrast the separate impact of the Nephites. Mosiah 29 has King Mosiah and the senior Alma as high priest. Both of them work a great deal to bring about peace among the Nephites and enjoy considerable success in their endeavors. Contrasting this is Nehor in Alma chapter 1 and Amlici in Alma chapter 2 and 3. Nehor is presented as the antithesis of Alma, as he fosters priestcraft and is a murderer. Amlici is the antithesis of King Mosiah, as he tries to undo Mosiah's system of judges by reestablishing himself as a king. In both cases, these men bring about contention and upset the peaceful order of things so as to promote themselves. Note, in both negative cases, Mormon takes considerable space in the text to moralize and make comments. So Mormon takes time out there. He's not just recounting history. We see the heavy editorial hand of Mormon making comment on what's going on at the time. Mormon's intent is to show how much influence individuals can have on a larger group of people for both good and evil, but more especially when it comes to evil. Okay, and then we go into Alma chapter 4. In year 6 of the reign of the judges, the people repent because they've had a lot of afflictions, and the church largely prospers and does well. It says thousands of people are baptized. But then by year 8, the people start going bad. So it only takes about two or so years for people to get comfortable and wealthy, and then the population stratifies again by wealth and opportunities for, advancement in their society. And then things get ugly again. So Alma chooses to retire from being the chief judge and commits himself to being the high priest to manage the church full time. So again, this speaks well for Alma because he's willing to let go of any political power he might have as the chief judge, and takes over to preach the gospel, to get people to repent and return. I mean, this really tells us that Alma's conversion was solid, it was genuine, and it wasn't just a temporary thing. And then this leads right into Alma chapter 5, which is next week's lesson, which is this really powerful, him bearing down a really powerful testimony to get people to repent and return to the church. So that pretty much wraps it up for this week, and we will see you next week.